the Berlin Conference. This is where 14 European powers in the United States in 1884 all meet. There's this rush to Africa. It's being colonized. They meet without any leaders from Africa to basically set the rules of engagement for how to divide and conquer Africa. I just wonder how important you think that is to understanding where we are today, is going back to colonialism and how it was carved up by the European powers.
Yeah, it's hugely important to understand the pre-colonial period and then the colonial period and what are the legacies of that for the post-colonial period. And at the same time, which we'll get into, it's been 60 plus years, and how long can you must always separate the structural constraints with decisions that are being made and who's responsible for that. And it's driven to try to come with, as you said, rules of the road. It's also about making sure that a couple of countries get their, this is what the King of Belgium called it, a piece of that magnificent pie.
He wanted it for himself, right?
Yeah, so they divide up the continent, and mostly that's France and Britain. The Germans get a couple of colonies, modern-day Namibia, modern-day Tanzania, without the island of Zanzibar, Rwanda, and Burundi. You get Spain, which gets Equatorial Guinea, and Portugal, which had actually had been there almost the longest, but they have 5 colonies. And so they set out these new markers, which divides communities and people and language groups and religion. If you look at the continent, most socioeconomic livelihoods, all of that is actually horizontal, right? Like bands, climate bands. So similar people doing similar things, and that's how empires, they move from east to west, particularly when you're talking about West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. But the Europeans colonize at the coast first. So they're building colonies that are going vertical. And so just by going vertical, you are bring in a huge set of diverse people. So in Nigeria, for example, you have 250 different ethnic groups. There's a couple of countries that are homogenous, largely one ethnic group or largely one religion, but most of them have multiple ones. Only 2 countries are not colonized. That's Liberia, where the U.S. sends freed slaves, and Ethiopia.
As I was reading, I stumbled across this 2011 study. It was by professors at Harvard and NYU called Artificial States. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not, but
They basically, and this goes along with what you're talking about, they did an assessment of, like, in the world, what are the most artificially drawn borders, and found, I think it was like 9 out of the 13 most artificial borders in the world are in Africa. And it kind of analyzed the challenges in government, development, social cohesion that have happened because of the just crazy borders that were formed, and how they split different ethnic groups and languages, and how that kind of sowed the seeds of conflict that came later.
Yeah, that's a well-known thesis. The other one that you didn't mention, but it's important, is some of these states are so large, Congo, Mali, that there's really a tyranny of distance in terms of just being able to project power and do the basic things that a state does. So that's also a consequence of the way in which these states were formed in the colonial period. There's a famous book by Professor Jeffrey Herbst called Power and State in Africa, which really looks at how was pre-colonial power dispensed, and often it was in much smaller states where you could at least have some authority, de facto authority over that community, and maybe you had states that would maybe have some level of indirect relationship where they paid taxes or they paid alms, but the states were much smaller because it was much easier to be, even if it's not ethnically or religiously homogenous, but to project power.
But that's a pain in the ass if you're a colonial power and you're trying to control vast portions of land and extract economic resources, because you don't want to have to negotiate with each individual clan and area. Isn't that what happened? That the colonial powers were like, hey, if we group them together in huge countries and put somebody over them, give them a bunch of weapons and allow them to rule this, it would make it easier for us to exploit resources.
Yeah, almost all of these states are governed by the Brits and the French in particular, with skeleton crews. And what the Brits do in particular is something called indirect rule. So in Nigeria, a country which I know really well, there was first a caliphate and then a sultanate, right? Religious leaders who controlled vast parts of northern Nigeria, and they just ended up reporting to the Brits. So you could have only a couple of Brits, and then the traditional leaders would be able to govern as they had been, except now they're collecting taxes or they're following through on whatever the Brits have asked for in terms of particular raw materials. And in places where that didn't exist, where there wasn't sort of natural empires or big states, the Brits would create what they called warrant chiefs. So they would say to someone, this happened in parts of the southeast, I should say, you're now in charge and we are now going to govern through you. The French were a little more in terms of indirect rule, but again, they came up with all of these systems to how to manage this large population in this large area that I think had consequences for how governance was thought about. Extractive, not much of a connection to the people, and I think we're living with some of that today.